So in this episode of Let's Talk, Chris Moser, public television producer and writer, talks about the changes in journalism from the 1970s through to the 1990s. What were the changes that you found during that period from 1975 to 2001 in your experience as a journalist?
Well, at that point, of course, cable news had come along, starting with CNN in the early 1980s, 24-hour news on cable, and so that was the change that gave me that job, obviously. But what was happening that was more fundamental was what led to serious problems for journalism. You know, and we've got to go back to American colonial times when newspapers were evolving, both in the colonies and in Europe, and some newspapers were very business oriented, and some were politically oriented, some were revolutionary, and then eventually publishers figured out that regardless of what they put on their editorial pages, which people might or might not agree with, if they made that separate, and in their news sections, their front pages and the rest of the news sections, they tried to be as objective and honest and comprehensive and journalistically solid and trustworthy. If people thought they could believe the news printed in the news sections, that they would buy the newspapers, regardless of whether or not they agreed that much with the editorial slant. And that became the paradigm that prevailed for a couple of 100 years. Quality journalism with an attempt to be objective and fair was a business decision. And that paradigm prevailed until the 1980s in this country, when some right-wing talk radio personalities, led off by Rush Limbaugh, figured out that they didn't have to appeal to as wide an audience as possible in order to make money and gain power and influence. They could focus on just a segment, in their cases, the very conservative segment of the audience, and still be very successful. And then in the years following that, eventually in the 90s, the digital age started kicking in. And then there were all these other sources of quote unquote news, where people were getting their information or their misinformation or their disinformation from sources that were not necessarily employing experienced editors and journalists. And anybody could put on could grab their phone and call himself or herself a journalist, and the quality, the gatekeeping, the quality control, and the gatekeeping were no longer important to a lot of people out there. And so as the audience, the reading and listening and viewing audience for the traditional mainstream news sources diminished, then their commercial base, their advertising dollars diminished, their resources diminished, and they had less money to put into quality. And the networks spent their money on more on high-priced anchors instead of more bureaus around the country and around the world, and more money for investigative reporting and so forth. And so it's a spiral. Of course, newspapers were having a harder time selling print newspapers, trying to compete with the free news online. And so journalism has come into quite a turbulent time. And the worst of it is that people now get cocooned into often their very biased sources of so-called news.
We have more on the way, so please subscribe to this channel and check out the link below if you'd consider becoming a patron to help us keep making more content. Thanks for watching.